Hello, I'm Alta Ifland, and I will talk today about a concept that has been very present in the past year or so on the minds of many American writers. It's called cultural appropriation, but I will talk about it in a way that is different than the way it's currently discussed in the United States. So those of you who are familiar with the term know that it's being used mostly in discussions related um, to so-called appropriation by white uh, writers from so-called brown or black writers. And so it's talked about in relation to literature, but only in relation to racial tensions, which is kind of absurd because if you talk about cultural appropriation, it should apply to everything that represents culture and everything that represents appropriation. Um, so I should say that current racial tensions are obviously very real in the United States. It's a very serious issue, and these tensions should be dealt with. They should be dealt with in real life, and not by redefining a whole concept of literature, because literature is something that is universal. And when you redefine a whole concept of literature according to specific American problems, you are creating a big problem. So I would also say that literature is in its very essence cultural appropriation, um, because literature only exists in dialogue with other works of literature, and the better a work of literature is, the more it quotes or it makes references to other works of literature. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of intertextuality, which means that every text of literature incorporates texts or references from other works of art. So really, literature cannot even exist, and you cannot talk about literature outside of cultural appropriation, because it's all made of appropriation. And in fact, if you really think about it, we all are appropriation in our being. None of us is some kind of a bubble separated from the others. Any single culture is a culture of appropriation. So I would like to take this discussion even in another direction. Well, by saying, first of all, that if one were to really apply the concept of cultural appropriation to the whole of literature, one would have to really, I mean, literature itself would have to disappear, because literature cannot exist outside of cultural appropriation. So to make this, to see how absurd this is, let me take my own situation as a writer. How do you define cultural appropriation when you are talking about a writer who had to leave her home country, her country of birth, and emigrate for political reasons or for economic reasons, for that matter? Anybody could emigrate for whatever reasons. I'm not in an extremely special situation. There are many writers like me today. So how do you define cultural appropriation in the case of a writer who leaves her home country and then emigrates to another country, and then she is literally forced to appropriate the language, not only the culture, but she has to start with the language of her new country? And in fact, somebody like me was forced to appropriate two languages, because first I got a degree in French, and I started to write as a writer in French because I couldn't write in English. I mean, when I came to this country, my English was very, very poor. I already had a bachelor in French, and so then I got a PhD in French. And at some point, I became a French writer. I was able to write almost like a French person. And actually, my first book of creative writing was in French, a book of prose poems, and it got an important French prize. So basically, I had to become a writer, because I was never a writer in Romanian language, even though that language is probably the language I master best, or actually, to be honest, at this point, I can't say that I have a native language at this point because I lost the mastery of Romanian, and obviously I'm, no matter how how much I perfect my English, English is not my native language, and neither is French. So basically, I had to appropriate two cultures and two languages. And believe me, this is for for Americans out there. Believe me, it's not easy to appropriate. It's actually very, very difficult. So yeah, how do you define cultural appropriation for these writers? For writers like me who are in themselves a monument to cultural appropriation. How do you define cultural appropriation for these writers? I'm afraid that most Americans would never address these questions because American writers never have to imagine that they have to emigrate. At least they didn't have to imagine until now. I have a feeling that things are going to change from now on. Still, even if American writers and Americans in general emigrate, they never have to change their language. And this is essential. They never have to change their language because everybody speaks their language. So they never have to imagine what it actually means to do the most difficult act of appropriation, and actually one of the hardest things that you can do in your life, to learn a foreign language. Because in order to learn a foreign language like your own, that actually is an impossibility. You can't do that. You can get, well, you can do it because you cannot reinvent your childhood, because language is also, we associate language with times in our lives. So if you didn't learn a language as a child, you don't have that association. So you can never learn a language like a native person. So Americans never have to change their language. They never have to appropriate another language. They have the luxury, the privilege of not doing this. But most of the world doesn't have this luxury. I didn't have this luxury. I had to appropriate. And as I said, you try to appropriate another language and then we'll talk. Uh, yes. For the rest of the world, a writer is no longer a representative of a nation or even a language, never mind an ethnic or racial group. It used to be that Dante equaled Italy, equaled Italian language. It used to be that Shakespeare equaled England, equaled English language. Goethe equaled Germany, equaled German language. Eminescu equaled Romania, equaled Romanian language. But this has changed. This is no longer true. Now there are writers like Yoko Tawada, who can equal both Japan and Germany, Alexander Hammond, who can equal both Bosnia and the United States, Yun Li, both China and the United States. This is evident to the entire world, except the United States. While on the rest of the planet, the vision of literature has progressed from a local space, that of the nation, to a global one, that of the entire world, in the United States, the reverse has been happening. Now it is considered unacceptable to take on other identities than that of your own ethnic or racial group. This phenomenon, which is framed as progressive or part of some kind of progressive ideology, is in fact extremely regressive. And I'm afraid it is part of the same tribalism that has taken over the American society. Or maybe not quite the same tribalism, but another type of tribalism, because basically we are now being caught between two types of tribalism, one from the right side of political spectrum and another one from the left side of the political spectrum. Two types of tribalism, both dangerous. So, when Flaubert wrote in 19th century Madame Bovary, and not, I don't know, let's say The Scarlet Letter or any other book that he could have written, he didn't do this because he thought it was morally wrong for a Frenchman to write about another country or about another society. He didn't do it because it would have simply been ridiculous for him to write about something that he didn't have experience with, that something that he didn't really master in a, serious and deep way. So to bring this to our discussion about cultural appropriation, writers have the freedom to identify with whomever they want. You can be a Frenchman and write about an American if you want so, or a Romanian and write about a Frenchman. You have this freedom. But at the same time, you have limitations, and these limitations are simply the limits of your imagination. There are things that you won't be able to do properly because human imagination has limits. And no matter how great your imagination is, it's still based on reality. And if you don't have an experience, obviously, the description of that reality is going to be problematic. But this doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to do it or that somebody should forbid you doing this. These are two very different things. So the truth is that no human being can really fully understand another human being. This is an existential impossibility. But this impossibility doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. How, and just as importantly, why we do it, should then be the question. Thank you.